The winter of 1883 had been the harshest in memory across the Colorado Territory, blanketing the high country in snow so deep that even the hardiest ranchers struggled to keep their livestock alive. Eleanor Ellie Hawthorne stood at the kitchen window of her isolated cabin, watching the endless white expanse that surrounded her small homestead and feeling the familiar weight of solitude that had become her constant companion since her husband's death 2 years earlier. At 34, Ellie possessed the kind of resilient beauty that frontier life either destroyed or refined into something unbreakable. The mountain weather had carved fine lines around her green eyes and streaked her auburn hair with premature silver, but her bearing remained straight and determined, the posture of someone who had learned to survive alone in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth. "Come on, girls," she murmured to her 3 remaining cattle, as she pulled on her heavy coat and prepared for the daily battle of keeping her small herd alive through another brutal night. The animals huddled together in the makeshift shelter she'd built against the barn, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air that reminded her constantly how close they all lived to the edge of disaster. Ellie had been making this evening trek for 3 months now, carrying hay and grain to animals that represented her only hope of financial survival. The Hawthorne Ranch sat in a remote valley 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by mountains that turned deadly beautiful in winter and cut off from neighbors who might offer assistance during emergencies. The discovery that would change everything came as she rounded the corner of her barn, her lantern casting dancing shadows across the snow-covered ground. A dark shape lay motionless near the tree line, partially buried by the latest snowfall, but clearly out of place in the pristine white landscape. Ellie approached cautiously, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle she always carried during winter chores. Living alone had taught her to be suspicious of anything unexpected, especially shapes that might represent predators or other threats to her precarious existence. What she found challenged every assumption she held about danger and death in the wilderness. A Native American warrior lay frozen in the snow, his dark skin blue with cold, and his body positioned as if he had simply laid down to rest and never awakened. He appeared to be in his 20s, with the lean build and weathered features of someone who had spent his entire life in harsh mountain conditions. The man's clothing and weapons marked him as Ute, one of the tribes that had been forcibly relocated to reservations, but still occasionally appeared in the high country during hunting seasons or when fleeing government authorities. His presence near her homestead could indicate anything from a hunting accident to a desperate flight from pursuing soldiers. Ellie knelt beside the body, her practical nature overcoming the instinctive fear that most settlers felt when encountering deceased Native Americans. Whatever conflicts existed between their peoples, this man was now simply a human being who had died alone in the wilderness, far from family and the burial rites that would honor his passage from this world. "Poor soul," she whispered, noting the peaceful expression on his face that suggested he had accepted death rather than fighting it. Nobody should die alone in the cold like this. The warrior's weapons, a well-crafted bow and a knife with an intricately carved handle, spoke of someone who had been respected within his community. His clothing showed evidence of careful craftsmanship, with beadwork and decorations that indicated high status or special spiritual significance. Most settlers in Ellie's position would have either left the body for scavengers or reported it to authorities who would dispose of it without ceremony. The presence of a dead Indian near a homestead could bring unwanted attention from both military patrols and tribal members seeking to retrieve their fallen warrior. But Ellie found herself thinking of her own husband's death and how important it had been to her that he receive a proper burial with dignity and respect. The idea of leaving this man to freeze and be torn apart by wild animals violated everything she believed about basic human decency. "I can't just leave you out here," she said quietly, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "Whatever brought you to this place, you deserve better than becoming food for wolves." The decision to bury the warrior would require considerable effort and risk. The ground was frozen solid, making digging extremely difficult. More importantly, providing burial for a Native American could be interpreted by nervous neighbors as evidence of sympathy for hostiles or even collaboration with tribal enemies. But as Ellie looked at the peaceful face of the dead warrior, she felt compelled by the same moral conviction that had sustained her through 2 years of widowhood and isolation. Some things mattered more than practical considerations or social approval, and treating the dead with dignity was one of them. "Tomorrow," she promised the still form. "Tomorrow I'll give you a proper resting place." That night, as Ellie prepared for bed in her lonely cabin, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since her husband's death. The task ahead would be difficult and potentially dangerous, but it would also be an act of compassion that honored both the dead warrior and her own principles. She had no way of knowing that her decision would set in motion events that would transform her understanding of life, death, and the mysterious connections that bound all living beings together. Chapter 2. The burial dawn broke grey and cold over the mountain valley, bringing with it the kind of bitter wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Ellie had spent a restless night planning the logistics of what she had committed herself to do, understanding that burying a body in winter ground would test both her physical strength and her determination to follow through on promises made to the dead. She began by moving the warrior's body to a more sheltered location near a grove of aspens that offered some protection from the wind. The effort required considerable strength, as the frozen corpse was unwieldy and heavier than she had anticipated. Working alone, she had to rest frequently to avoid exhaustion that could prove dangerous in the extreme cold. "I don't even know your name," she said quietly, as she arranged the body with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. "But wherever your spirit has gone, I hope you know that someone cared enough to do this right." The burial site she selected lay on a small rise overlooking the valley, with a view of the distant peaks that dominated the landscape. It seemed appropriate that a mountain warrior should rest in a place where he could see the eternal grandeur of the high country, even in death. Digging in frozen ground proved to be backbreaking work that took most of the day. Ellie used a combination of pickaxe, shovel, and burning wood to gradually create a grave deep enough to protect the body from scavengers. Her hands, despite heavy gloves, became raw and bleeding from the constant friction of tools against unforgiving earth. As she worked, Ellie found herself wondering about the warrior's life and the circumstances that had brought him to die alone in her remote valley. Had he been hunting when storm or injury overtook him? Was he fleeing from something or someone? Did he have family members who would mourn his disappearance and never know what became of him? "I wish I could get word to your people," she said during one of her rest breaks, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "They should know you died with courage, in a beautiful place, cared for by someone who respected your passing." The actual burial took place as evening shadows began to lengthen across the snow-covered landscape. Ellie had wrapped the warrior in her best blanket, a wedding gift that represented her most precious possession, and placed his weapons beside him, according to what she hoped were appropriate customs. She had no knowledge of Ute burial practices, but her instincts told her that a warrior's weapons should accompany him on whatever journey awaited beyond death. The bow and knife were beautiful examples of craftsmanship that spoke of a culture far more sophisticated than most white settlers understood or acknowledged. "Lord," Ellie prayed as she began covering the grave with earth and stones, "I don't know this man's beliefs or what names he called on when he needed comfort, but I know he was somebody's son, maybe somebody's father or husband. Please watch over his spirit and let his people find peace about his passing." The work was completed by lantern light, with Ellie using her remaining strength to build a small cairn of stones that would mark the grave and protect it from disturbance. She had no way of creating a proper headstone, but the marker she constructed was sturdy and respectful, a monument to an unknown man who had lived and died far from home. As she gathered her tools and prepared to return to her cabin, Ellie noticed something that made her pause in wonder. A small fire seemed to be burning among the trees near the burial site, its warm glow creating a circle of golden light in the gathering darkness. Her first thought was that sparks from her lantern had somehow ignited dry brush or fallen leaves, creating a potential wildfire that could threaten her homestead. But as she approached to investigate, the fire seemed to retreat deeper into the forest, always remaining visible, but never close enough for her to determine its source or fuel. "That's strange," she murmured, holding her lantern higher to get a better view of the mysterious flames. But the fire continued to dance just beyond the reach of her light, neither growing larger nor diminishing, maintaining a steady glow that seemed almost deliberate in its consistency. Eventually, exhaustion and cold forced Ellie to abandon her investigation and return to her cabin. But throughout the evening, as she prepared a simple meal and tended to her own needs, she found herself glancing out the window toward the burial site, where the mysterious fire continued to burn. Must be some kind of natural gas seepage, she told herself, though she had never heard of such phenomena occurring in their mountain region, or maybe phosphorescence from decaying vegetation under the snow. But even as she offered rational explanations for what she had witnessed, Ellie felt a sense of wonder and unease that defied logical analysis. The fire seemed too controlled, too purposeful to be the result of random natural processes. As she prepared for bed, Ellie found herself thinking about Native American beliefs regarding death and the spirit world. Her late husband had occasionally traded with Ute bands and had shared stories about their conviction that the spirits of the dead remained connected to the physical world, especially when proper burial rituals had not been performed. "Don't be foolish," she chided herself as she checked the locks on her doors and windows. "You're letting isolation and exhaustion make you see things that aren't really there." But when she extinguished her own lamps and looked out toward the burial site one final time before sleep, the mysterious fire still burned steadily among the trees, casting its warm glow across the snow-covered grave where an unknown warrior rested beneath stones, placed by the gentle hands of a lonely woman who had chosen compassion over fear. That night, Ellie's dreams were filled with images of mountain landscapes and the sound of drums beating in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She dreamed of a young man with kind eyes who spoke in a language she didn't understand, but whose meaning seemed clear. Gratitude for kindness shown to a stranger, and a promise that such generosity would not be forgotten. When she awakened before dawn, the first thing Ellie did was look toward the burial site. The mysterious fire still burned, brighter now than it had been the night before, as if fed by some source that grew stronger rather than weaker with the passage of time. Something was happening that challenged everything she thought she understood about life, death, and the world she inhabited, alone in her remote mountain valley. Chapter 3. The Growing Light. The mysterious fire continued to burn for 7 consecutive nights, growing brighter and more substantial with each passing evening. What had begun as a small flickering glow among the trees had evolved into a steady beacon that illuminated the entire burial site and cast dancing shadows across the snow-covered valley floor. Ellie found herself drawn to the phenomenon with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. Each evening after completing her chores, she would stand at her cabin window and watch the flames dance among the aspens, their warm golden light creating an island of seeming warmth in the frozen landscape. "This isn't natural," she admitted to herself on the 8th morning, acknowledging what her practical mind had been reluctant to accept. No earthly fire could burn for over a week without fuel, especially in conditions where snow and bitter cold should have extinguished any normal flames within hours. The implications of supernatural activity in her remote valley were troubling enough without the additional complications that began manifesting during the 2nd week. Ellie started noticing changes in her immediate environment that suggested the mysterious fire was affecting more than just the burial site. Her 3 remaining cattle, which had been weakening steadily throughout the harsh winter, suddenly seemed healthier and more energetic. Their coats grew thicker and glossier, and they began producing milk again despite the inadequate nutrition that winter grazing provided. Most remarkably, they showed no fear of venturing near the area where the fire burned, often grazing peacefully within sight of the glowing flames. "It's like they know it's not dangerous," Ellie observed, watching her prize heifer approach within yards of the mysterious light, without showing any of the skittishness that cattle normally displayed around fire. More unsettling were the changes she noticed in herself. The chronic exhaustion that had plagued her since her husband's death seemed to be lifting, replaced by an energy and vitality she hadn't felt in years. Her sleep, previously troubled by lonely dreams and worry about survival, became deep and restorative, filled with vivid visions of mountain meadows blooming with wildflowers and streams running clear under summer skies. "I feel like I'm 25 again," she confided to her reflection in the mirror, noting that the premature lines around her eyes seemed less pronounced, and her hair appeared to be regaining some of its original auburn richness. But the most significant change was the gradual erosion of the bone-deep loneliness that had been her constant companion since becoming a widow. The presence of the mysterious fire seemed to fill some essential void in her existence, providing a sense of companionship that she couldn't rationally explain but found increasingly difficult to live without. On the 14th night, Ellie made a decision that she recognized as either courageous or foolish, depending on one's perspective about supernatural phenomena. Instead of observing the fire from the safety of her cabin, she would approach it directly and attempt to understand what was happening in her valley. "If this thing means me harm, I suppose I'll find out soon enough," she said aloud, surprised by her own calmness as she pulled on her heavy coat and picked up a lantern. "And if it doesn't, well, maybe it's time I stopped being afraid of the unknown." The walk to the burial site felt different than her previous visits, as if the very air around the mysterious fire was charged with energy that made her skin tingle and her heartbeat quicken. The flames, which had always retreated when she approached before, now remained steady and welcoming, casting a circle of warmth that seemed to defy the bitter mountain cold. As Ellie entered the circle of light, she experienced a sensation unlike anything in her previous experience. The air within the fire's influence felt spring-like and gentle, carrying scents of pine sap and wildflowers that shouldn't have existed in the depths of winter. The snow beneath her feet seemed less deep, and the wind that had been howling across the valley all day fell to a whisper. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she whispered, looking around in wonder at what appeared to be a pocket of different weather existing within the larger winter landscape. The burial cairn she had constructed 2 weeks earlier now seemed to glow with its own internal light, the stones arranged with perfect symmetry that she didn't remember achieving during her exhausted construction efforts. Wildflowers, impossible wildflowers that couldn't survive mountain winter, bloomed between the rocks, their bright colors almost shocking against the white snow that surrounded the affected area. But most remarkable of all was the figure that gradually became visible as her eyes adjusted to the supernatural light. The warrior she had buried sat cross-legged beside his own grave, his form translucent but clearly defined, watching her with eyes that held depths of gratitude and wisdom. Ellie's rational mind screamed at her to flee from what was obviously a ghost or spirit manifestation. But her heart, which had been starved for meaningful connection since her husband's death, recognized something benevolent and protective in the warrior's presence. "You're real," she said softly, her voice carrying wonder rather than fear. "Or at least, you're something real." The warrior spoke, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, using words in a language she didn't understand, but whose meaning somehow reached her heart directly. He was thanking her, she realized, expressing gratitude for the dignity and respect she had shown his mortal remains. "I only did what seemed right," Ellie replied, feeling surprisingly natural about conversing with a spirit. "Nobody should die alone and unremembered." The warrior smiled, his expression conveying approval and something deeper, a recognition of kinship between two souls who understood loneliness and the importance of connection across the boundaries that seemed to separate all living beings. For the next hour, Ellie remained within the circle of supernatural warmth, experiencing a sense of peace and companionship that fed her spirit in ways she hadn't realized were possible. The warrior didn't speak again, but his presence was profoundly comforting, like sitting with a dear friend who required no conversation to provide meaningful company. When she finally returned to her cabin, Ellie felt fundamentally changed by the encounter. The loneliness that had defined her existence for 2 years had been replaced by the certain knowledge that she was no longer truly alone in her remote valley. Whatever the warrior represented, spirit, ghost, or something beyond her understanding, his presence was a gift that transformed her entire relationship with solitude and isolation. That night, she slept more peacefully than at any time since her husband's death, warmed by the knowledge that compassion shown to strangers could create bonds that transcended death itself. Chapter 4. The Warning. 3 weeks after her first direct encounter with the warrior's spirit, Ellie had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible during her previous life of isolation and fear. Each evening, she would complete her chores and then spend an hour sitting within the circle of supernatural warmth, sharing silent companionship with the ghostly figure who had become her most treasured friend. The warrior, whom she had begun thinking of as Joseph, though she had no knowledge of his actual name, seemed to grow more substantial with each passing night. His translucent form became increasingly solid, and his ability to communicate expanded beyond simple emotional impressions to something approaching actual conversation. "The spring will come early this year," he told her one evening, his voice now clear enough that she could detect the accent and inflections of someone who had learned English as a second language. "The snows will melt quickly, and the valley will bloom as it has not bloomed in many seasons." Ellie had learned not to question the impossible nature of their conversations, accepting that grief and loneliness had somehow opened doorways in her perception that allowed communication across the boundary between life and death. Whether Joseph was truly the spirit of the buried warrior, or a creation of her own desperate need for companionship, seemed less important than the comfort and guidance his presence provided. "How do you know about the spring?" she asked, genuinely curious about the source of his prophetic knowledge. "The dead see time differently than the living," Joseph replied, with the patient tone of someone explaining complex concepts to a beloved but limited student. "Past and future flow together like streams joining a river. I see what was, what is, and what will be as parts of the same eternal moment." These conversations had filled many of the lonely evening hours throughout the harsh winter, providing Ellie with insights into Ute culture, philosophy, and spiritual beliefs that no white person had ever been privileged to receive. Joseph spoke of his people's connection to the land, their understanding of death as transition rather than ending, and their belief that acts of kindness created obligations that transcended physical existence. "You gave me peace when I was lost between worlds," he explained during one of their talks. "Now I give you the same gift. Peace in your loneliness, warmth in your cold valley, hope in your difficult life." But on this particular evening, Joseph's usual serenity was replaced by something approaching urgency. His form flickered more than usual, and his expression carried warning rather than the calm wisdom that characterized their normal interactions. "Eleanor," he said, using her full name for the first time, "danger comes to the valley. Men with hatred in their hearts and violence in their hands. They seek to take what you have built, to destroy what you have protected." Ellie felt her stomach tighten with familiar fear, the same dread that had characterized her early days of widowhood, when every sound might signal approaching threat. "What kind of danger?" "Outlaws, Indians, soldiers, white men from the town below. They have heard stories of the strange fires in your valley, and their superstition has turned to greed. They believe you have found gold or silver, that the lights come from mining operations you keep secret from others." The explanation made perfect sense in a territory where mineral discoveries could transform ordinary people into wealthy landowners overnight. The mysterious lights that provided Ellie with supernatural companionship would appear to distant observers as evidence of smelting operations or other mining activities that suggested hidden wealth. "When will they come?" Ellie asked, her practical mind already calculating options for defense or escape. 3 days, perhaps 4. 6 men led by one who calls himself Morrison. They come not to steal openly, but to force you to sell your land for little money, or to claim it has been abandoned if you refuse their offers. Ellie knew Morrison by reputation, a brutal man who had acquired several properties in the region through intimidation and violence, always managing to stay just within the boundaries of territorial law while destroying the lives of anyone who opposed his ambitions. His interest in her homestead represented a threat that could end her independence and possibly her life. "What can I do?" she asked, feeling the familiar helplessness that had characterized much of her struggle to survive alone in the wilderness. Joseph's form seemed to grow more solid and determined as he considered her question. "You have shown kindness to the dead, respect for those your people consider enemies. Now the spirits of this valley will show kindness to you." "Well, what does that mean?" "It means," Joseph said with something approaching a smile, "that you are not as alone as these men believe, and that some debts can only be repaid with protection of those who have earned the friendship of the spirit world." As if summoned by his words, other translucent figures began appearing around the edges of the firelight, warriors from different eras and tribes, all bearing the same expression of protective determination that marked Joseph's ghostly features. Ellie counted at least a dozen spirits, their forms ranging from ancient hunters carrying stone-tipped spears to more recent warriors bearing rifles and metal weapons. "Who are they?" Ellie whispered, awed by the gathering of supernatural defenders. "Warriors who died in this valley over many generations," Joseph explained. "Men who fought and fell defending their people, their homes, their sacred places. Your act of kindness to one of us has called us all to your protection." The sight of so many spirit warriors should have terrified Ellie, but instead she felt a surge of confidence and determination that reminded her of the woman she had been before grief and isolation had worn away her natural courage. These ghostly figures represented something she had never possessed during her married life, a community of protectors who owed their loyalty to her personally rather than to her status as someone's wife. "What will you do when Morrison comes?" she asked. Joseph's expression grew grim with the promise of supernatural justice. "We will remind him that some places are protected by powers older and stronger than territorial law, and that those who threaten the innocent do so at the risk of their own souls." As the spirit warriors faded back into the darkness, leaving only Joseph's steady presence beside the eternal fire, Ellie felt a transformation taking place within her own heart. The frightened widow who had struggled alone against impossible odds was evolving into something stronger, a woman protected by forces beyond the physical world, confident in her right to defend the home she had built with her own hands and the courage she had discovered in her own heart. The confrontation with Morrison would test not only her resolve, but the reality of the supernatural protection she had been promised. But for the first time since her husband's death, Ellie faced an approaching crisis with hope rather than despair, knowing that she would not face it alone. Chapter 5. The Guardian Spirits. Final chapter. The confrontation came on a bitterly cold morning in late February, when the mountain air was so still that the sound of approaching horses carried across the valley like thunder. Ellie stood at her cabin window, watching 6 riders emerge from the tree line, with the predatory confidence of men accustomed to taking whatever they wanted through intimidation and violence. Morrison himself was exactly what she had expected. A large, brutal-looking man whose expensive clothing couldn't disguise the cruelty that marked his weathered features. The 5 men with him bore the unmistakable look of hired guns, their hands resting casually on weapon grips as they surveyed her modest homestead with calculating eyes. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Morrison called out as the group halted in front of her cabin, his voice carrying false courtesy that fooled no one. "Mighty lonely place you've got here. Mighty dangerous for a woman living all by herself." Ellie emerged onto her porch with the calm dignity she had learned from her evening conversations with Joseph, her rifle held in a ready but not immediately threatening position. 3 months of supernatural companionship had restored the confidence that grief and isolation had stolen from her spirit. "Mr. Morrison," she replied evenly, "this is private property. State your business or move along." Morrison's smile held no warmth as he dismounted and approached her porch with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating weaker opponents. "Now, that's no way to treat neighbors who've come to help. We've heard tell of strange lights in this valley, and we're concerned they might indicate dangerous gas seepage or unstable ground that could threaten your safety." "The lights are not your concern," Ellie said firmly, "and I haven't asked for your help or protection." "See, that's where you're wrong, widow lady." Morrison's tone dropped its pretense of politeness, revealing the menace that lay beneath. "Those lights suggest mineral deposits that are too valuable to leave in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to develop them properly. We're prepared to offer you a fair price for your land, $500 for the whole spread." The insulting offer confirmed what Ellie had suspected. Morrison intended to acquire her property through coercion rather than legitimate negotiation. $500 wouldn't buy a decent horse, much less a homestead that had taken years of backbreaking work to establish. "The property is not for sale at any price," Ellie replied with the finality of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "You need to leave my land immediately." Morrison's face darkened with the ugly anger of a man unaccustomed to defiance from those he considered his social inferiors. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mrs. Hawthorne. This valley is isolated, dangerous country. Accidents happen to people who don't accept reasonable offers for their own protection." The threat hung in the cold air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Ellie felt the familiar flutter of fear that had characterized her early days of widowhood. But alongside that fear was something new, a bone-deep confidence that she was not facing this threat alone. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation." As if summoned by her words, the temperature around the cabin began to drop precipitously, causing the men's horses to stamp nervously and their breath to form thick clouds in air that had suddenly become arctic in its intensity. Morrison looked around with growing unease as an unnatural silence settled over the valley. "What the hell?" one of his men began, but his words were cut short as ghostly figures began materializing around the edges of the cabin clearing. Joseph appeared first, his translucent form now solid enough to cast shadows in the weak winter sunlight, followed by the dozen other spirit warriors who had pledged their protection to the woman who had shown respect for their dead. Morrison's hired guns reached for their weapons with the reflexive panic of men confronting something beyond their understanding or experience, but their hands passed through gun grips that had suddenly become intangible, as if the spirit warriors were selectively altering the physical laws that governed the confrontation. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison whispered, his face pale with a terror that reduced him to the frightened bully he had always been beneath his veneer of confidence. "What are those things?" "They are the guardians of this valley," Ellie replied with quiet authority, stepping down from her porch to stand among the spirit warriors who had become her supernatural family. Warriors who died defending their homes, their people, their sacred places, and they don't take kindly to men who threaten the innocent. Joseph stepped forward, his form now so substantial that Morrison instinctively backed away, despite his greater size and physical strength. When the spirit warrior spoke, his voice carried the accumulated authority of generations of protectors who had faced death rather than surrender what they held sacred. "Morrison," Joseph said, his accent making the name sound like a curse, "you come to this place with violence in your heart and theft in your plans. The spirits of this valley have marked you as an enemy of the peace that dwells here." "This is impossible," Morrison stammered, his worldview crumbling as he confronted evidence of supernatural forces that existed beyond his ability to intimidate or control. "Ghosts aren't real. This is some kind of trick, some kind of—" His words were cut short as one of the other spirit warriors, an ancient hunter bearing stone-tipped weapons, reached out to touch Morrison's face with ghostly fingers. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Morrison aged visibly, his hair turning white and deep lines carving themselves into his features as decades of future suffering compressed into moments of supernatural judgment. "You will leave this valley and never return," Joseph continued with implacable certainty. "You will abandon your plans to acquire this woman's land, and you will remember that some places are protected by powers older and stronger than your greed." Morrison's men were already mounting their horses, their faces white with terror, as they prepared to flee from something that challenged every assumption they held about the nature of reality. But Morrison himself seemed frozen in place, caught between his lifetime habit of bullying the weak and his sudden confrontation with forces that reduced him to insignificance. "If you ever threaten this woman again," Joseph said, leaning close enough that Morrison could feel the supernatural cold that emanated from his ghostly form, "the spirits of every warrior who ever died in these mountains will hunt you to the ends of the earth. This is our promise, and the dead always keep their word." The transformation in Morrison was complete and permanent. The brutal confidence that had characterized his approach to the valley had been replaced by the hunted look of someone who had glimpsed the spiritual consequences of his earthly actions. He mounted his horse with shaking hands and rode away without another word, followed by his men who spurred their mounts to desperate speed in their eagerness to escape the supernatural judgment they had witnessed. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the spirit warriors began to fade as well, their protective duty completed and their promise fulfilled. Only Joseph remained, his form still solid and warm in the gathering twilight. "They will not return," he assured Ellie, as they walked together toward the eternal fire that had brought them into each other's lives. "Morrison will spend his remaining years fighting his own nightmares, remembering what he saw here, and knowing that some debts follow men beyond death." 5 years had passed since that confrontation, and the spring of 1888 found Ellie's Valley transformed into something that defied every expectation about life in the harsh Colorado mountains. The early spring that Joseph had predicted had indeed arrived, bringing with it wildflowers, abundant grass, and prosperity that seemed to flow from the supernatural protection that watched over her land. Ellie herself had changed as well, evolving from a lonely widow into a confident woman whose unusual circumstances had attracted other lonely souls seeking community and acceptance. The valley now housed a small settlement of people who had found refuge from various forms of persecution or hardship, all protected by the same spiritual forces that had saved Ellie from Morrison's greed. "You know," she said to Joseph one evening, as they sat beside the eternal fire that still burned with supernatural warmth, "sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had just left your body for the wolves that first night." "Then you would still be alone," Joseph replied with the wisdom that had characterized all their conversations, "and I would still be lost between worlds." Acts of kindness create connections that transform both the giver and the receiver. The small community that had grown around Ellie's homestead included a diverse collection of individuals: a former slave seeking freedom in the mountains, a Chinese immigrant fleeing persecution in the mining camps, a young woman escaping an abusive marriage, and several other souls who had found sanctuary in a valley protected by forces beyond human understanding. "Do you think they'll stay?" Ellie asked, watching smoke rise from the cabins where her new neighbors had built their own modest homes. "They will stay as long as the valley welcomes them," Joseph assured her. "Places touched by genuine compassion become refuges for all who seek peace rather than power." As the stars emerged over their mountain sanctuary, Ellie reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate isolation to the center of a community built on supernatural protection and human kindness. A simple decision to provide decent burial for a stranger had grown into something far larger than she could have imagined, a demonstration that respect for the dead could create bonds with the living that transcended every boundary that seemed to separate people from each other. The eternal fire continued to burn beside Joseph's grave, no longer mysterious but familiar, a beacon that drew together those who needed sanctuary and reminded them that some places in the world remained sacred, protected by guardians who understood that compassion was the strongest force in any realm, physical or spiritual. Joseph's ghostly presence had taught her that loneliness was a choice rather than a permanent condition, and that acts of simple human decency could create communities of protection that lasted far beyond any individual lifetime. The warrior's body lay at rest beneath the wildflowers that bloomed in impossible abundance, but his spirit lived on in the sanctuary they had created together, a place where the living and the dead coexisted in peaceful harmony, proving that love and respect could indeed conquer every form of darkness.